Okay, this is section 4 of chapter 8. It is the last section of the chapter. Your objective for this chapter is that you should be able to describe all the aspects of the manor. So looking at your notes, your first question is, what was the manor? The manor was the home of the vast majority of people who were living in Western Europe. So in places like Italy, France, Germany, Spain. And the manor was pretty much a self-contained farming community. And it was controlled by the Lord. So this was the Lord's fief, right? His land grant that he had from the king, or if he was the king, okay? This is his land, and he controls it, and it's farmed by peasants. Okay, and not all of these peasants would be serfs, and we'll talk about the different kinds of people that lived on the manor in a few slides. But when we talk about something being self-contained, that means that everything on this manor, this farming community, okay, it's all here. Like, they don't need to leave their farming community to get most of the things that they need. So on the manor, we have, a church. We have different skilled workers, and a skilled worker is someone like a blacksmith. And the manor could be very, very small, or it could be very, very large. It could have one village, or it could have dozens of villages. It could have a couple of families, or it could have hundreds of families. It just depends on the wealth of the Lord, okay, and how much land that particular Lord controlled. And most items they could produce on the manor. They would have their own livestock, so they'd have their own like cows to get milk, and own chickens and all of that kind of stuff. But there's some items that they could not produce, and these items would be things like salt, iron, or tar. Okay, and they would need to leave the manor and trade for those elsewhere, or they would pray, that usually they'd have like caravans, trade caravans that would come through, and they would get those items from them that way. And you see this little map here. You can see there's a barn in the manor house. There's a mill, and that's where you would take like your grain to make into flour. There's a bake house, so that's where like the bread would be baked. Okay, the description of the manor. The village is at the center of the manor. The village is usually near a water source, whether that be a river or a creek or the well. When we watch the Dark Ages documentary in class, they talk about people no longer having running water because of the disrepair of the Roman aqueducts and going into, using wells instead. So your village might center around a well where everyone could come get their water. Peasants usually lived in clusters, and you can kind of see that here, all those little tiny blue dots near the village area. Those are the peasants' homes. They're small cottages. They're not very nice or luxurious. Usually when it was really cold outside, you had your livestock live inside of the home with you. So you would have like pigs, and sometimes even your cow would stay inside of the house with you. So it definitely does not smell very good. And then you have the Lord's home would be the biggest building or biggest home on the manor, and then the church would also be one of the largest buildings on the manor. So if you were like looking at the whole piece of property, those would stand out to you. And we talked about this already in class. If there was an attack on the manor, you would usually, as a villager, if you were a peasant or the priest who was living outside of the Lord's house, outside of the castle, if there was an attack on the castle, you'd run inside the castle to be safe as refuge, okay? And then they would, draw up the drawbridge and stay in the castle and try to defend it from there, because the castle, in essence, was a fort. The church is the kind of multi-purpose building on the manor. It's used for worship. It's used for village meetings. If there's a crime that's been committed, we need to use it as a court. It could be used as that it could be used for that as well. And sometimes, remember, we discussed this in class, that the Lord's home could be used as a court too. The church is also used for social gatherings. And then you want to know that 1/3 to 1/6 of the land was set aside as the Lord's domain. And that meant that that was the land that he liked, the land that he thought was the most fertile or productive. and then the rest was given away to the villagers. Okay, and that most fertile land that I've just told you guys, that's called the domain. He would usually have, the villagers would have to go and work that land part-time for him. And we'll talk about what that's called on a different slide so you guys can take the notes at that time. You want to know the difference between a 2-field system and a 3-field system. So depending on the type of crop you plant, you're going to want to rotate which fields that you use, okay? Because if you're constantly planting in the same field, it will strip that field of all of its like minerals that help the crops grow. So it'll make it not fertile anymore. The 2-field system, you would plant one field and then you'd leave the other fields fallow, so you'd leave it alone. You wouldn't plant anything there to help it recover its fertility, and then you would switch. And usually what would happen is you'd have one for spring planting and one for fall planting, and you'd go back and forth. And then you'd have a 3-field system, and this was mostly used in Northern Europe, which would leave one field alone, wouldn't plant anything there. They would plant one for fall, and then they'd plant one for spring. So your picture here is an example of the 3-field system. Okay, so the people on the manor pretty much mirrors the type of social classes that you could find throughout all of medieval Europe, and that's that you have the clergy, then you have the nobility, and then you have the peasants. So on every manor there will be the presence of clergy, there'll definitely be some nobility, and there'll definitely be some peasants. So remember that beginning title in your textbook that said some to pray, some to fight, some to work. So that's the clergy, the nobility, the peasants. A very small percentage of people on the manor were actually freemen, and a freeman was a person that was a very privileged peasant. They usually had some kind of skill set so that they weren't just the average laborer. They were blacksmiths, millers, carpenters. Some could be, you know, officials that were helping govern the manor. Some of them owned their own land. They actually owned it. It didn't belong to the Lord. And they were exempt from working in the Lord's fields, usually because if you're a blacksmith, we don't want you farming. We want you to be doing your blacksmith job. And freemen, they're free men because they're allowed to leave the manor, where a serf or a peasant is kind of tied to the manor unless the Lord allows them to travel from it. Okay, the majority of those living on the manor were serfs, which is midway between a slave and a freeman. And they're, like I was saying, are bound to the manor. They have to stay on the manor unless the Lord gives them permission to leave. They are given a small portion of land to provide for their own family, so they farm that land to feed their family. But since they owe the Lord their services, and they have to pay him sometimes, remember in the form of aids, they have to give to the Lord some for things like, you know, a daughter's wedding or a son becoming knight. They have to go work his land. So they had to devote 2 to 3 days a week to working for their Lord on his domain. And that was referred to as a week work. And serfs also had to pay, not just in their produce, but if they had fish, if they took fish from the river or the creek that was on the Lord's land, any dairy they might have, grain they might have, they would have to pay a percentage of that to the Lord. Okay, daily life on the manor. What was it like? Peasants very rarely went any further than 20 miles from the place they were born. So that's quite significant. Think about that. That's like saying you've lived in Las Vegas and you've never really quite made it to California, and you haven't made it to Arizona, and you live your whole entire life just in Las Vegas pretty much. Okay, you don't really go too far. Granted, your life is a pretty short lifespan back then because of disease. You know, you're lucky to make it into your 40s during this time period. There's 2 major holidays that are celebrated on the manor. That's Easter and Christmas. Christmas is a 2-week holiday, and that's where we get the 12 days of Christmas. You have May Day, and May Day is kind of like a celebration of spring, and that's where, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the maypole, where they put the pole up and it's got, everyone has like a ribbon and they go around it. And then there's a harvest day, which is like Thanksgiving, celebrating the harvest. But overall, life on the manor is not very pleasant, unless you're the Lord. It could be pleasant, maybe. People are very, very poor, generally miserable. Any little money that you have is going to the Lord in the form of rent or in fees, or you're tithing to the church. There's a lot of famine. Famines when there's not enough food, so people are starving. There's a lot of war, and like I said, disease. So you're not living a very long, healthy life. Okay, so here is your paragraph shrink. Please write your paragraph shrinks. There is no excuse to not be doing them. Okay, and this is your SRQ. Where did the vast majority of people in Europe during the Middle Ages live? They lived on manors. What two buildings dominated the manor? The Lord's residence, the Lord's house or castle is acceptable too, and the village church. Name the term that described the peasant laborers on the manor. They were known as serfs. And why did the peasants work for their lord and give him part of the crops they raised? Well, because they had to pay him. It was their return for the use of his land and its resources. Okay, reminders for tomorrow. Bring supplies for your review dividers and for your board games.